Hello everyone and welcome back to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. So without further ado, sit back, relax and enjoy. I'm writing more out of desperation. I don't care about the consequences or how people I know might react. It all started that summer, toward evening. We were with Andrew, plus a couple of our other friends, sitting in a gazebo not far from the bus stop, and for about an hour, we'd been discussing my new job. Andrew, also known as Drew, began to tell a story. I had one grandmother in a small town in Louisiana. She lived down in the lowland, almost right under the bridge, in a wooden shack. Half her garden got washed away by the swamp, terrible in general. They said she was a witch. So many stories going around, like she'd poke a baby's little head with her finger, or set up jars of cow intestines out in the woods, or pass by someone's flower bed and give it a look and the flowers would wilt. Who knows what's true? About half a year ago, she died. I happened to be there on my winter vacation. I was shoveling snow in the yard and saw a black cloud rising up. I took a closer look, and it was a flock of crows, so many of them, like someone had scattered seeds in the sky. I got so scared I dropped my shovel. I judged where they were flying and froze on the spot, even though I'd been sweating from working. They were circling right above the old woman's shack. Then I heard from a neighbor that, if a witch dies, she needs to pass on her power to someone, or else she'll go straight to hell. Apparently, she couldn't pass it on to anyone, so that flock of crows came for her soul. Horrible, our female friend answered quietly. Drew poked her with a finger. Listen on. You all know I like to put on some kind of scary audio in my headphones before going to bed. That same evening, I turned on one of the tracks I downloaded and didn't even notice when I drifted off. Now imagine the narrator's voice is dictating the plot, and the same plot plays out in my dream like a movie. And it was a crazy story about witches in some small town. By the storyline, there's a one-eyed old lady walking around the house, knocking on windows, softly asking, look at me, and then suddenly, smack in the middle of the recordings, she shrieks something. The author turned out to be a jokester who threw in jump scares. I jumped up, soaking wet, heart pounding, my chest burning, not understanding if I was still asleep or awake. It seemed like the old woman was at the window, and something was moving in the darkness. The bed was creaking, and I almost started bawling, even though I'm this big lug who just recently came back from the army. It was that scary. Well, even that terror is nothing compared to what's waiting for Max at his new job. Everyone turned to look at me. Laughter erupted. Drew joined in too, and I silently punched him in the shoulder and quickly changed the subject. He's a jerk, of course. He knew how nervous I was. And here's the thing. Since about 2006 or 2007, in a neighboring county, the first fully functioning 24-hour store opened. A scary, hunchbacked woman ran it, mostly hiring migrants. The first rumors of forced labor started about 10 years later, when there was a scandal involving a newborn boy and one woman who escaped, but it all got hushed up. After the pandemic, everything came to light again. It turned out people were vanishing in batches, 9 or 10 people a year. Journalists and officials showed up, along with the New Orleans prosecutor's office. In short, to put it briefly, the case was big. The owner, that hunchbacked woman, was locked away, and the remaining workers got stuck in bureaucratic hell. The building stood closed for a couple of years, and then a local resident bought it and reopened the store. At first, only the day shift worked there. Then word got around that the new boss was looking for someone to cover nights. I really needed money, and I couldn't work days because of college. So I jumped on it, went for a meeting, and asked for the job. The owner, not wanting to overpay, was looking for a strong guy who could be both a salesperson and a security guard in one person. We agreed on $60 per shift. We shook hands, and I went home. I was supposed to arrive at 10 p.m., cover up the alcohol display with a plastic sheet, supposedly not for sale, and work right through until 10 a.m. When my friends at the gazebo heard about my new workplace, they immediately remembered the disappearances and the hunchbacked woman. Drew instantly made up a story that on her first day in jail, she was thrown onto knives, and now she wanders around her former store as a ghost. Then, as if from a bucket, they poured out all sorts of scary tales. I actually enjoyed listening to them, but as soon as I left the guys and got on the last bus, my heart clenched with anxiety. Soon, it got a bit easier, especially when, instead of the bloody crypt that Drew had painted in my mind, I saw a regular retail area with humming fridges and some festive lights. The day shift cashier gave me instructions, showed me where everything was, handed over the key to the server room with the CCTV cameras, and taught me how to handle late-night drinkers safely. There was a bell on the front door, so you could hear everyone coming in. I wasn't worried about missing a customer. After seeing my coworker out, I didn't just sit in one place, I went to check the back rooms. A curtain separated them from the store area. Behind it, a hallway stretched in two directions with doors. One led to the server room, another to a stock room, a third to the bathroom, and a fourth door was sealed off. Later I learned that workers used to live there, and now it's empty. Nothing interesting in the server room, but in the stock room, one odd detail caught my eye right away. There was a rug on the wall, behind a wooden shelving unit. Chuckling, I took a picture of it and sent it to our group chat. That amused the guys as well. Drew was one of the first to joke that the rug covered a hole leading to an underground passage where a coffin with the hunchback woman was kept. I rolled my eyes at his message, turned to leave, and suddenly heard the doorbell ring. Someone had come in from outside. I quickly shoved my phone in my pocket and rushed back to the sales floor. There was an older woman at the counter, holding a cat. She asked for half a kilo of cookies and some milk. While I was messing with the plastic bags and the scale, the cat suddenly jerked, puffed up its fur, jumped out of her arms, and ran behind the curtain straight into the back. The woman tried to chase it, but I stopped her, mumbled something incoherent and rude about no animals allowed, and dashed after the cat. It didn't take long to find. It had run into the only open door from the stockroom and stopped by some empty cardboard boxes in the corner. I stood there and thought I'd slip off my jacket to cover my arms and grab that crazy furball without getting scratched. I wanted to scoop it up like in a hammock and bring it back to its owner at the checkout. But for some reason, I hesitated, closely watching what the cat was staring at. It was gazing at the rug. A seed of dread took root in me at that moment, but I didn't let it grow. The cat arched and hissed, so I made a wide step and tossed my jacket over it. Annoyed, I returned to the store area, but neither the customer nor the bag of cookies was there anymore. A cold sweat broke out on my back. Did she rob the register? I ran to check, but everything was in place. Then I sprinted to the door, locked it, and went to the server room to check the camera recordings. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Surely no one would come up with a cat scheme just to steal some cookies. She must have taken something else. While I was figuring out how to rewind the footage, I heard a strange rustling in the hallway. Drew's voice from my imagination boomed, like something from the grave. "How could you not understand?" he sneered. She never left. She's still here. My shoulders and neck prickled with goosebumps. I was shaking all over. Glancing around the server room, I grabbed an empty plastic flower pot standing by the wall and stepped out. The noise was coming from the stockroom. I raised my makeshift weapon, ready to fling it at the intruder's face. I walked quietly, hoping to appear suddenly and hit her right in the nose. I slipped through the open doorway, swung, and froze. No one. That's when it got truly terrifying. Boxes rustled off to the side. One box flew to the middle of the room, and out from behind the shelves ran the cat. Furious, I threw the pot at it, missed, and instantly regretted taking out my frustration on an innocent animal. I went back to the server room, shut the door behind me, and reviewed the footage. My gut feeling was right. The woman hadn't limited herself to just one bag of cookies. While I was chasing her cat, she had grabbed a sealed 100-gram cup of vodka from behind the counter and fled. I then found a tutorial online for how to erase footage, and I wiped what I didn't need, the part with me chasing her with the pot, and covered the cost of the stolen goods out of my own pocket. I did catch the cat, fed it some sausage, and left it outside the store. Surprisingly, the rest of the night was calm. There were few customers, mostly buying bootleg liquor in dark plastic bags or a bit of food to go with it. A couple of times, someone asked for credit, but I refused. In the morning, while I was about to go to class, I asked the day shift cashier if she knew anything about that rug in the stockroom. She giggled, shrugged, and said she never even noticed it. After my classes, I slept very little, but I never thought of skipping work. The pay was just too good, overshadowing the fear and lack of sleep I'd experienced during the night. Yet the rug kept nagging at me. With a bit of free time, I dragged my coworker back there. She reluctantly followed. It's probably soaked with spices, she supposed while I moved the shelf. That's what the cat smelled. Max, you should read a book or something instead of freaking out over some rag. By then, I had completely cleared the way to the rug, grabbed the dusty bottom corner near the floor, and lifted it. What we saw left my coworker speechless. I couldn't say anything either and just stared at the grate now exposed. The bars were simple and vertical, not very thick, and behind them, just darkness. Part of a concrete floor was visible and a curved piece of iron. Looking more closely, I realized it was a handrail. That meant somewhere in the darkness, there had to be stairs. Max, do you hear me? My coworker rasped and then started coughing. Her voice was trembling. Close it. There's nothing for us down there, it's not our business. I looked at her. She stood in the doorway, pale as a sheet. Fear seeped through me. I let go of the corner of the rug, and it fell back over the strange grate. We left the stockroom. My coworker said nothing, and I didn't know what to say either. By the exit, I managed to muster my courage and ask, not at all confidently, "You don't think this has anything to do with..." I wanted to mention those big cases of missing people, but she interrupted me. "Stop it, please," she pleaded, almost asking God for mercy, and then she left. So I did as she said. Because I was sleep deprived, I was reacting super intensely to everything that evening. And so, plain curiosity turned into an icy fear. I even locked the stockroom. There were so few customers, mostly the same familiar drunks, and while they were in the store, my anxiety subsided. But as soon as I was alone again, it started all over. Maybe once every couple of hours, I gathered my resolve and walked to the stockroom door, listening. The draft swept the floor. On the other side, something scuffed and rustled. To this day, I don't know if I really heard it or if I imagined it. I skipped class that day. I was wiped out, feeling sick to my stomach. I crashed into bed, waking up at 7 in the evening to my alarm. I went to our usual gazebo by the bus stop and saw Drew there. I told him about the grate. At first, he joked in his typical way, "You get it, Max?" In any horror story, the real trouble starts the moment the hero starts thinking he's smarter than the monster. They told you not to mess with it, so don't mess with it. But after talking a bit more, he got genuinely interested. I promised to take pictures and send them to him tonight, and he promised in return to try to drop by and help me. Maybe we'd find a way down to see what was on the stairs. That night, I locked the front door so no customer would interrupt, then went to move the shelf aside. This time, I decided just to remove the rug. It hung by loops on a thin wooden rail, and it came off easily. The first thing I noticed was a lock. It held two of the bars together so the grate couldn't open. Near the floor, about 8 inches up, those bars were slightly bent, forming a gap wide enough that I could have slipped my head through. I took 2 pictures of the entire grate and sent them to Drew. He didn't see them yet. Then I switched on my phone's flashlight and lit up the space on the other side. It wasn't large, maybe about 6 square meters, with a crooked iron banister and steps going down. I was about to snap a new picture when Drew messaged me back. I hesitated, replied to him, then opened my camera again, bringing my phone close to the grate. A cold draft grazed my feet. Something rustled in the dark. I shivered, shook my shoulders, and went to turn on the flash for better lighting, all while still aiming the phone at the darkness. My frozen finger hovered over the little lightning bolt icon. Right below that, on the screen, in the darkness where the stairs must have been, a trembling white square popped up. My camera recognized someone's face. I ran as if I were on fire, sprinting down the hallway to the store, then to the exit and out into the street. My whole body felt like it was jolted with electricity, and the tension made it impossible to breathe. I couldn't take a gulp of air and fell to my knees. The jolt of pain shot through my legs, bringing me back to my senses. There was nobody around, an empty street, the disgusting store sign, and the flashing word groceries on the facade. I hobbled onto the porch, sat on the step half turned toward the door, afraid to let it out of my sight, and called Drew. I didn't have the patience to text him. My hands were shaking too much, mixing up the letters. On the phone, I was practically screaming, stammering, begging my friend to come. At first, he refused calmly, saying he had work tomorrow. This made me so mad. Here I was, terrified out of my mind, shaking head to toe, and Drew was shrugging it off, offering every possible explanation. Max, your camera glitched. Why are you yelling? Of course there's a draft. It's probably some basement. I felt so hurt I wanted to vomit. Our entire conversation sounded like the ravings of 2 lunatics. The air felt suffocating. My head spun. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant barking of stray dogs, nothing. Just me, scared to death, his indifferent voice in my ear, and that mind-numbing neon sign. Finally, Drew gave in. I swear, you'll nag a dead man, he growled and added flatly, fine. Wait there. Then time sped up. According to the clock, I'd sat there nearly 20 minutes, but it felt like only 10 had passed. A disgruntled Drew arrived by taxi, got out, and walked into the store first. Show me, he said, looking around. I led him to the back room. We stopped at the grate. Drew squatted, touched the bars, scratched his head, and said, someone definitely pried these open. Ice filled my veins. The first time I saw them, when I half-jokingly wondered if I could slip my head between them, it hadn't even crossed my mind why those 2 bars were bent. Now it was all clear. You can erase the camera footage, right? Drew asked. I nodded. Any tools, wrenches, or a pry bar? I'll try to break the lock. Wait, maybe the fire safety cabinet has an axe or a crowbar? I stayed silent in numb horror. All right, man of mystery, stop panicking. I'll stay here with you tonight, and tomorrow we'll break it open. I'll bring the tools from home and even find a new lock so nobody will know. That's enough trembling for now. Let's put the rug back. We cleaned up and returned to the sales area. Drew stayed with me until about 8 in the morning, then left for work. 2 hours remained before my replacement arrived. They went by peacefully. Customers were more frequent, sunlight streamed in, burning away my cold fear. Later at home, I slept poorly. Even there, strange noises echoed in my head. Then I had a nightmare. The white square on my phone screen again settled on some invisible face, only this time it zoomed in until the view was gone. Suddenly, right in front of me, appeared something so vile that I woke up instantly. By evening, I had no energy or motivation. I felt weak and sick, as if some indescribable entity living beneath the store was stealing more and more of my strength every night. Around 11:30, Drew arrived with a shoulder bag. I locked up, switched off the server room recordings, and Drew went straight to the stockroom. Using 2 wrenches, he broke the lock and opened the grate. We armed ourselves with our phone flashlights and stepped through. The descent was short, just 1 flight. Then a long corridor stretched out, with a low ceiling and uneven floor. Drew went first, and I forced myself to follow, even though the horror was choking me like a noose around my neck. It stank horribly of something indescribable, dampness mixed with a revolting odor I couldn't identify. I'd never smelled anything like it. The corridor kept going, seemed to narrow, too. At first, we only had to tilt our heads a bit, then, after a minute, we were practically hunched over. I was barely holding it together, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, Drew stopped short. I almost shrieked and asked him why, but I didn't have to. I saw it myself. We were at the edge of a drop-off. Something like water seemed to be gurgling below. Drew turned around, his eyes bulging in terror, and hissed through clenched teeth, "Run!" I was about to lose my mind from fear. I was exhausted, lowered my phone, and the beam of light fell downward, illuminating for a moment the space beneath us, a huge pit shaped like a crater, filled with hundreds of small, tadpole-like monsters. They had no eyes or noses, just wide mouths full of rotting gums and tiny teeth. They scurried on all fours, scrambling with thin limbs bearing slimy, worm-like appendages that looked like fins. When we shone that faint light on them, we basically stirred up a cursed nest. The buzzing or roaring grew louder, and that's when I realized it wasn't water gurgling but a cacophony of voices. I don't know what language they were spewing, but the meaning was clear. Those hideous creatures were ravenous. They grabbed Drew almost instantly. He fought back, tried to break free, screamed my name, begging for help. His frantic cries still echo in my head. But those starving abominations showed no mercy. They devoured him, gnashing bones, tearing off his flesh, ripping out hair by the handful. Before Drew fell silent, I managed to make it back to the stairs. There was nothing else I could do. Clutching my friend's shredded bag, I bolted outside. I ran a couple of blocks, caught my breath, and called my boss, then the police. To everyone, I told the same story. Someone burst out of the stockroom, chased me, and I didn't see his face or physique because I never looked back. My tinkering with the server room recordings helped me. No one would ever know the truth. The detective questioned me for a long time, but he kept things to himself, as if he wanted me to say something specific. I just shook my head, repeating my rehearsed lie. Soon after, the store closed again. New rumors and legends spread through town, and only one detail unsettled me. They said people saw deliveries of rebar and cement going into the building. But the worst happened later, when one night I got a call from a familiar number, Drew's number. By that point, even the volunteers who'd been searching for him had lost all hope. I didn't answer. I blocked the caller and spent the rest of the night in tears. I don't know who used his phone to call me, but I'd bet my life it wasn't my friend. Because in that foul pit, there was someone else, someone intelligent enough to negotiate with the store's previous owner for live food to feed those tiny mutants. And I'm convinced my phone camera recognized the being's face that dreadful night. For more than a year, I jumped at every little thing, afraid that it would hunt me down. but my own inner demons were worse. What happened broke me. A few months of therapy and a ton of pills restored my health somewhat, but the guilt and depression still torment me. This story is my last attempt at confession. If even this exposure doesn't help, then there's no hope of recovery left at all. Caleb had been handing out flyers for Clear Vision Optics for 3 hours already. He was terribly thirsty and had regretted 100 times that he hadn't brought money for mineral water. Actually, he didn't have much money at all, since every penny counted. Coming from Greenfield to Los Angeles for his studies, he had to find part-time jobs just to make ends meet, or balance debits and credits, as they said in their accounting faculty. On the roadway, violating traffic rules, a black SUV stopped, immediately drawing the poor student's attention. A portly man in black glasses got out nonchalantly and, to Caleb's surprise, walked right toward him. That instantly made him wary. The driver approached the student and spoke in a hoarse voice, without preamble. "Hey, kid, you working?" A gold chain the size of a pinky finger dangled around the stranger's neck. The young man slowly nodded. "I bet you're an out-of-town student," he continued the interrogation, and again Caleb responded with a nod. "Ah, don't tense up," the man said with an unpleasant smile. "I'm talking business here, basically. I won't beat around the bush. I've got a night store downtown. The saleswoman got sick, and I literally need someone for just one night to sit at the cash register. If you show up in the morning, $100 is yours. If you're not interested, then I'll head out, and you can keep handing out these flyers for that weirdly named thing. I'll find someone else. Don't be nervous, kid. I'm just from out of town myself, so I try to help those who are starting out in a new city. How much are they offering you for those flyers?" $20, Caleb answered quietly and wearily. "See, that's what I mean. I'm giving you $100 for one night. Basically, I don't have time to worry about it, so while I have a smoke, think it over, you've got exactly 3 minutes." With these words, the portly man turned and headed back to his SUV, trampling over the lawn. Caleb stood there as though stunned. Too much information and so dubious, but he needed the money like never before. Besides, what could really happen to him? It was the central street, covered with cameras. And when the driver started the car, Caleb called out to him and ran across the lawn to give his consent. The shift started at 2200 hours. The store turned out to be an ordinary booth with a back room, a counter, and lots of shelves around the trading area. It looked like it came straight from the 90s. Its owner wasted no time on niceties as he quickly brought Caleb up to speed and assured him not to worry about safety. No hooligan ever came near his store. He knew them all by name and commanded respect. The student's duties included handling sales, cleaning the back room after the shift, and greeting customers with a smile. The shelves had the same goods as any other shop, only the prices were slightly lower, nothing out of the ordinary. But when they went to the storage area, Caleb's attention was drawn to a huge, frosty chest freezer locked with a padlock. Seeing where the student was looking, Arthur Walker, as the man introduced himself, rasped sternly, "Don't you dare go near that. There's special merchandise in there for special customers. God forbid anything goes missing, you won't get your $100, and you'll pay for it forever. Got it, kid?" A heavy hand landed on Caleb's slight shoulder, and he nodded in agreement. "Good," the owner said. "That's it. I'm off. In the morning I'll be here, and if you feel like trying anything, don't forget, I know where you study. And remember, take everything the customers offer, and keep smiling." The phone showed 21:49. The working night would begin soon. Caleb opened the cash register and noticed something strange. It had no dividers for bills or coins, just a metal tray. He glanced wearily at the merchandise, then sat on the stool and opened VK on his phone. The first customer was an elderly lady. She spent a long time examining the goods, marveling at the low prices. Then, taking 5 kilograms of sugar and 3 packs of buckwheat, she barely managed to carry them to the register, paid, and quickly left, as if those groceries were being hunted. Buyers trickled in, and every one of them was amazed by the good prices and high-quality products. Periodically, Caleb ducked into the back room, which doubled as a storeroom, to bring out new goods and restock the empty shelves. But at one point, when he carried out flour and sugar, they slipped from his arms. The store and its merchandise changed. The shelves were no longer stocked with canned goods, grains, salt, and sugar. Instead, they were filled with severed ears, fingers, and noses. Where pickled tomatoes and cucumbers once stood in glass jars, there were torn-out nails and eyeballs floating inside. The right-hand display now offered rusty hooks with bits of flesh still on them, chains, and manual cultivators. Right at the entrance stood 2 bloody trash cans, one for arms, the other for legs. Horrified, Caleb turned to his left. The confectionery section now presented a huge selection of severed feet and hands, and a little farther on, like fish strung up on a thick rope of barbed wire, were severed heads of various ages and genders left to dry. On the counter, just a meter from the rusty register, were several large jars full of intestines, sorted by type and expiration date. One jar contained relatively fresh ones, soaking in somewhat clean alcohol. In another jar, they were shriveled at the bottom in a yellowish aldehyde. There were no price tags, and the ceiling was decorated with cobwebs of barbed wire. His pulse quickened, and his breathing grew rapid. Caleb grabbed his phone and bolted for the exit. He slammed into something and fell back toward the counter, lightly hitting his head. An invisible force field seemed to shove him away. Another attempt ended the same way. Approaching slowly, he tried touching the doorway, and the air felt solid as concrete. Maybe he could have run before the store turned into this nightmare. Right, his phone. Frantically, he tried calling a friend, but the subscriber was out of range. He tried a second friend, to no avail. There was always the emergency number. With trembling fingers, he dialed, only to be met by silence. There was no signal. Defeated, he glanced at his phone clock, 0:03. Sighing in resignation, Caleb returned to the counter and glared at the exit. With the horrifying metamorphosis, the door had vanished, replaced by a black void. At that moment, the first customer who needed such special products started to enter the store. Slowly, as if swimming underwater, an impossibly thin and excessively tall woman drifted into the pavilion. Her long black hair floated around her on its own, like the snakes of Medusa. Her bony frame was covered by a rumpled, dirty blue dress with burgundy patterns. She had to bow low to pass inside, and the moment this terrifying stranger lifted her gaze, Caleb let out a shrill yelp and dashed into the storeroom. The visitor's eye sockets were empty, black hollows. To Caleb's relief, the back room looked the same as before. He hid between the frosty chest freezer and the shelves of grains. The woman drifted to the counter and stopped, swaying slightly on her thin, pale legs. She clutched 2 orange banknotes from Imperial Times in her bony fingers, waiting for the clerk to appear. When he didn't come, this horrifying stranger struck the counter with all her might. Jars of intestines jumped, nearly falling. Even then, Caleb had no desire to leave his hiding spot. Another blow came, followed by the same ringing sound. Getting no response, the woman began a low, guttural howl that grew in volume with every second. Fully aware she wouldn't leave without getting what she wanted, Caleb trembled in horror, stood up, and forced his rubbery legs to the counter. When he emerged, the woman pointed her skeletal finger at a jar of eyeballs. The student nodded frantically, removed the glass lid, and handed the jar over at arm's length. Her yellow nails rummaged through the eyes, and when she found what she needed, she slowly pulled two out and, with a sickening squelch, inserted them into her empty eye sockets. She repeated the procedure, one eye being brown, the other blue. Rotating them as if to check they were working, she placed two $1 bills on the counter and drifted toward the exit. Caleb stood there, still holding the jar, for about 5 minutes. When he finally came to his senses, he nearly dropped it, but controlled himself and placed it back on the shelf. Dragging his feet, he stumbled toward the storeroom, but right then, a bright voice called out, "Hey there, cutie." A scalding chill crawled down his back. Slowly, he turned. At the threshold stood a smiling blonde, her hair in a bob cut, wearing a white tank top and a red and black plaid skirt. She repeated the line she'd just spoken, lifted her left arm, severed at the wrist, and waved a bloody stump in greeting. Then she started making her way to the counter. Her body jerked and twitched. She resembled one of the nurses from Silent Hill. Yet she kept smiling that stretched grin and repeating the same line over and over. Her face resembled a mask, with dead, glassy eyes and bluish lips, as though frozen in constant tension. It sounded like the words came from deep within her, with no change in her expression. Trembling, she reached the counter and gestured with the bloody stump toward the shelf of severed hands. Obediently, Caleb handed over what she wanted. Jerking and smiling unnervingly, she tried to fit the hand onto the severed joint, as if someone trying on clothes. She attempted to attach a woman's hand with a pale manicure, but it wouldn't stick. Then she repeated her familiar phrase and handed it back. Shaking, the student took the hand and put it back on the shelf. She pointed to the next one. The ghastly shopping continued until finally, with a click, one of the hands attached to her stump. The girl squealed in delight. Oddly enough, it was a man's hand, complete with several rings and a rising sun tattoo. Happily waving goodbye, she placed a thin stack of blood-stained $50 bills on the counter and wobbled out. The moment she disappeared into the darkness, Caleb remembered the cash register. Picking up the banknotes, he placed them in the tray, realizing at last why it had no compartments. You never knew what these infernal customers would bring. The stress subsided a bit, leaving him weak. He slumped onto the stool, his legs felt like jelly, and his eyes threatened to close. Just then, he heard shuffling footsteps. Looking up, he stifled a faint scream of terror. A headless man in a rescue service uniform was slowly lurching toward the register, swaying from side to side. In his hands, he carried a rotting, blackened head. Caleb practically sank into the stool. The man stopped in front of the register and set the head on the counter. It surveyed the area with glazed eyes, and when it finally spotted the student, it opened its mouth, smacked it a few times, and hissed, "You just gonna sit there? I need a head, a fresher one. This one's done for." Mustering all his courage, Caleb pushed himself up. At once, he stumbled against the sharp metal corner of a shelf and collapsed back onto the stool, knocking over some stray hands and feet. They fell to the floor. Again, the headless man barked, "Hey, man, you gonna sell me a head? Then pick that stuff up. Hurry it up. That third one on the left." A severed, waxy yellow head with a thick gray beard hung by barbed wire from its sliced neck, suspended by a rope. Terrified of disobeying, Caleb nodded quickly and rushed for the indicated item. The barbed wire wouldn't unwind, and he pricked his fingers until they bled. After about 7 minutes, the headless man lost patience and hissed, "Fine like that. New hires always mess up the first day." He grabbed the severed head from Caleb. Setting it on the counter, he laid down a gold signet ring, then ambled slowly out into the night. The moment he crossed the threshold, Caleb tossed the old head into the trash bin. Silence fell. Staring at his surroundings in a daze, he pinched himself hard, leaving a massive bruise on his arm. Unfortunately, this wasn't a dream. It wasn't a nightmare. He checked the time, 2:28. Thank God, at least time was flying. Suddenly, a soft knock startled him. He lifted his foggy gaze and stood unsteadily as another customer entered. Barefoot, dressed in black trousers, came a bald man with his throat slit and stitched together with black thread. The same thread sealed a Y-shaped autopsy incision on his torso. His skin was covered in prison tattoos, and he had no fingers on either hand. Approaching the shelf of severed fingers, he paused to inspect them, then used his steel teeth to pick them up one by one and twist them into his open stumps. The sight made Caleb dizzy, and he clung to the counter for support. Once he'd finished, the man squeezed his hands as if trying on gloves, then shuffled to the register and placed some amber prayer beads on it. He opened his mouth, mumbled something unintelligible, waved his hand, and left. Caleb managed to glimpse that the man had no tongue, just a purple stump. Resigned to the fact that he'd be dealing with these horrific customers until morning, the student sat back down on the stool. The next customer didn't keep him waiting. With a wet, gurgling noise, a massive man entered, his skin blue, his lifeless gray eyes clouded over. He breathed heavily, sweating something sticky, and lumbered to the counter. Grunting, he pointed a thick finger at a nearby jar of intestines. Caleb nodded slowly, removed the glass lid, and the man shook his head and opened his palm to show it wouldn't fit inside. Exhaling, the student forced himself to reach into the jar. Nausea hit him, but he fought it, ignoring the slimy, alcohol-soaked organs. Choking back his gag reflex, Caleb managed to grab hold of the intestine and hand it over. The giant man tilted his head back, opened his mouth wide, and noisily swallowed it. Then he looked questioningly at the student, pointed to the jar, and let out a loud snort, wanting more. The disgusting procedure repeated itself. Finally, the man reached into his pocket and dropped a handful of pearls into Caleb's hand. Turning awkwardly, he trudged out of the store, now seeming even larger than before. Once the hulking figure disappeared into the lingering darkness, Caleb tossed the pearls into the register tray and doubled over, vomiting. After cleaning up, he picked up the fallen hands and feet he'd forgotten and put them back. Then he slumped onto the stool again, hoping there'd be no more customers. Faint rays of light began to break through. Dawn was coming. He checked his watch, 4:07. Sleepiness overwhelmed him. Just as he was about to doze off, the sound of childish laughter rang out. Startled, he jumped to his feet more out of surprise than fear. Two conjoined twin boys scurried in, wearing old-fashioned brown suits and sharing a single pelvis, with 3 legs between them. They scuttled around like spiders, their pale faces covered in bruises and lumps, dark circles beneath their eyes, and a mischievous, devilish spark in their brown irises. Running in a circle around the pavilion, they finally stopped at the torture tool stand. Smiling as they deliberated, they nodded to each other and grabbed 2 handheld cultivators. Wobbling to the register, one dumped a pile of gemstones onto the counter. Without leaving the counter, they started striking each other with the tools. Flesh tore and blood spattered everywhere while they laughed gleefully. Seconds later, the fight ended as abruptly as it began. The twins gave a polite bow and, scuttling like an oversized spider, dashed out of the store. Seeing Dawn more and more clearly, Caleb leaned against the wall. Half on all fours, he laid his head on his hands and didn't realize when he drifted off. He woke to approaching footsteps. Raising his gaze, he saw Arthur Walker standing there with arms crossed over his chest. "Hey, kid," the owner snapped. "Are you sleeping or what? Anyway, we're done. Go sweep the back room, grab your cash, and get out." Caleb swept the back room with a forced smile, though a streak of gray now covered his right temple. Suddenly, the owner snuck up behind him and struck him on the back of the head with a baton. The student managed only a feeble gasp and collapsed face first onto the chest freezer. The portly man rolled him over and gripped his throat in a steel vise. Within minutes, it was over. Rising wearily, the killer wiped the sweat off his brow, removed the padlock, and opened the freezer. Inside lay a headless corpse of another victim. The owner lifted Caleb up, shoved him in, and locked it again. He smiled, exhaled, and removed his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. Where his eyes should have been, there was only an inky black void. Meanwhile, cheerful and always ready for something new, Alana was handing out invitations to a honey fair. A black SUV pulled up beside her, and a well-dressed man in black glasses got out and walked straight over. The girl stopped calling out to passers-by. "Kid, are you a student?" he asked, his gravelly voice resonating. She didn't answer. "You're not from here, right?" he asked again, with no response. "Don't be scared. I'm not some maniac. Listen, I won't beat around the bush. I've got a night store over in the Glendale district, and my saleswoman got sick. Need someone to fill in for her.